Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to the Caring Economy with me today. I'm your host, Toby Usnik. This is our 19th season in the Caring Economy, and we're really honored today to have MeiLin Wan with us. She's the founder and CEO of GenuTrace LLC. MeiLin is a trailblazer in supply chain traceability, and we're going to talk about that today because it's very critical to our markets today. With over 20 years of experience in helping global brands like Costco, Walmart, and Sainsbury verify the origins of nearly 1 billion pounds of cotton and other fibers. Her pioneering work with DNA tracers, genomic testing, and isotope analysis has set new industry standards for transparency and sustainability. MeiLin's expertise has been instrumental in helping companies comply with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which we'll talk about a bit today, as well as her leadership that has earned her recognition as one of the outstanding 50 Asian Americans. And today we're going to explore her journey, her innovations, her insights on building an ethical global supply chain. Not that that's any small task. So welcome to the Caring Economy, MeiLin.
Oh, so great to be here, Toby. I'm really excited to share some of my insights and also what's happened, since we started the company earlier this year.
We have to begin by giving a shout out to my friend, your family member, Marshall Richmond, who put us together. Thank you, Marshall. Your, I guess, sister-in-law or cousin-in-law.
Yeah, that's right.
It's great to me. So, MeiLin, we always ask our guests to just give us like a 3 or 4 minute digest of their life story, how they got where they got, maybe some mentors or pivots along the way. So, give us a sort of overview of MeiLin Wan, please.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to do that. I would say one of the themes in my life has been around the idea of identity because I grew up very young at the age of 4, where I immigrated from Malaysia and moved to Canada. And it was because there was a lot of political instability in Malaysia at the time.
Mm.
And so my parents felt it was a good idea to get their child out and maybe find a better place to live. And so my journey in life started at a very young age. And it really, I think, set the stage for my approach to traceability and also forming my own company because I had to learn very young to be independent. And living abroad is very difficult, especially when you're 4. And so when you're put out of your comfort zone at such a young age, you learn how to be more reliant and self-independent
Mhm.
and also more observant, I would say, about your environment
Mhm.
and appreciative of different cultures because when you're the one put into a different environment and then you have to then survive, you quickly have to determine whether you're going to actually survive in that environment. And so I would say it's quite similar to how companies today have to survive themselves. In the environment that we're in today, it's very challenging because there's so many external factors affecting your decision making and what to do.
Mhm.
And even in people's careers today, I think many people are uprooted from what they know. So, what do you do in the face of such adversity? And, how do you find a new way and a new path? And so, I would say, it's a very important topic, this idea of identity,
Mhm.
because it informs how we approach the truth in
Absolutely.
in the materials that we source, in the products that we buy as consumers, and what brands we trust.
Mhm.
Because there's so much information out there, it's really quite difficult for consumers to figure out what they should be buying.
When you left Malaysia, your parents stayed and they sent you abroad, or did your whole family move?
No, my parents stayed in Malaysia. They
Oh,
couldn't
did you go
leave.
to a relatives or a boarding school?
Yeah, stayed with my aunt in Canada. She was working with the First Nations people
Wow.
in Canada at the time. So I basically was taken out from Malaysia and put it in an environment with Canadian First Nations people
And cold
and,
weather.
and cold weather. So, I have a lot of empathy for people today who are not sure what to do because you could be in that situation where one day everything's sunny and the next day everything's not so great.
Yeah.
And so, I think this journey of, finding your path and also embracing the uncertainties is what makes people stronger and more resilient. So, yeah, my background is very global. I started in Malaysia at a very young age. I lived in Canada for a couple of years. My family then finally immigrated to Australia. I was able to then join them a few years later and then totally learn a new country from
Yeah.
scratch.
Yes. Second time.
And it's like, not many people would have to be put in that situation
Yeah.
at such a young age. So I'm happy to share that because not many people know. They
Yeah.
think, oh, she sounds a little Australian, but she also sounds a little American.
You could be whatever they need. Did you then stay through university in Australia or
Yeah, I did all of my schooling and university in Australia and ended up lecturing and running courses in strategic management and international management. And that's really how I got involved in teaching studies on, examples of, sweatshops that were happening in
Mhm.
Southeast Asia at the time. In the 90s, there was a lot of rampant issues related to forced labor
Mhm.
in sneaker factories. And fast forward in 2025, we still have forced labor in supply chains.
Yep. And it's getting more confusing again because of the political winds and globalization, which is never going to go away. But the trade winds are changing now, right? I mean, globalization is a fact. But let's go ahead for our audience and just why don't you sit up a little bit, MeiLin? So let's talk about the problem, so to speak, so we understand where you come in with an answer around supply chain verification. What is the big issue that you're trying to solve for in your career?
I would say that there are a number of issues related to supply chains. The biggest issue is that many supply chains are what we call opaque. And a lot of these supply chains would like to stay anonymous. That is the pre sort of disposition of supply chains. And part of it has to do with the fact that there's some competitive advantages, maybe of working with certain suppliers, and that's been happening for decades.
Mhm.
And many of the supply chains operate under paper documentation. So this whole system is based on paper, and this paper could be easily manipulated and changed. So if you say I'm using 100% Egyptian cotton, I'll put on the piece of paper exactly that, even though it may be absolutely no Egyptian cotton
Yes.
in the yarn or in the fabric. And that is just a basic problem. And it's not just in cotton, it's in virtually every material in the world that's made today. And that's what's very shocking to many people who are not doing this on a regular basis. I know it because I've been involved in it for 2 decades. But this sort of the masking of the supply chain and the anonymity that it has been part and parcel of how brands and their supply chains operate has been such a huge issue. And so my role is to help provide more transparency and clarity
Mhm.
and visibility into the supply chain so that there are better decisions made about how materials are sourced, that ethical practices are happening amongst the not just within the company, but also with the suppliers and who they're working with. If they're sourcing materials, are they coming from areas that don't have deforestation, for example, or are they sourcing sort of palm oil from an area that really should be using forced labor?
Mhm.
Or in the case of cotton, does that cotton have any risks from other regions? Been a lot of focus on cotton from parts of China,
Yeah.
But there's forced labor actually in cotton in lots of other
Yeah.
countries. So these are the problems I'm trying to solve because they affect every one of us because we are indirectly purchasing products
Mhm.
that utilize forced labor or unethical or unsafe, even unsafe chemicals
Mhm.
is an issue currently. So that's really what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. And what's really cool is the solution, which is science, right? DNA. Era where people debate whether there's one truth and facts and fiction. I'm a science person. I will always believe in science and research and truth. And so give us a sense of some of the things that you've pioneered or that you've worked in applying science to solve these problems.
Yeah, science can be extremely valuable, especially in these times where, you know, you don't know what people are saying is actually what's actually
Yeah.
happening
Mhm.
in the product, especially. And so my background actually is in business, so I never, trained or full on
Yeah.
scientist, but I worked with scientists long enough to have gained some appreciation of it through osmosis. And I could say that there are good tools out there that are available. DNA tagging, for example, is an area I worked in for many years, where you can apply the DNA molecular marker directly onto the fiber or onto the material itself. And that enables you to then know at the date, the time, the place, what product you tagged. It preserves the integrity and the quality of that material from the source all the way to the finished product. Isotope testing is a relatively new area in the field of cotton. It's actually been used in food and other areas for many, many years. But in cotton, it's been utilized in the last couple of years because of the Forced Labor Prevention Act that was implemented here in the US, which basically enables you to use this isotope method to tell you where that cotton comes from and where it really shouldn't come from.
Wow. So that how's that different from DNA? The DNA is organic matter ultimately, right? The isotope is that an isolated part of a molecule? I don't really remember my science as well as I should.
Well, DNA is actually DNA that is made as a molecular barcode. I think most people understand what a COVID test is, for
Mhm.
example, and COVID actually has a specific sequence and DNA sequence. So DNA tagging is the development of a specific sequence or barcode that then can be applied at parts per billion onto fibers or materials. And it's useful because you can apply it onto billions of fibers at relatively low cost and then be able to really have good resolution as to the exact fiber that was tagged at the time. Isotope testing relates to the actual chemical fingerprint that is developed in the cotton fiber over time, that absorbs the elements from the soil, what latitude, longitude it came from. So it's an internal fingerprint, whereas the DNA application relates to an external marker that's applied onto the surface of the material.
And would it be fair to say that with the isotope as an example, it's almost akin to a terroir, if for wine and vintage,
Yes.
it's very unique. Chalk in the Champagne region defines what Champagne is. It's not an arbitrary thing. So similar to that.
Yeah, the isotope methodology is great to sort of provide the provenance or the terroir around the region or the material. It's quite useful if you want to be able to verify from the farm level all the way to the finished product. You can do it for many different types of materials,
Yeah.
not just cotton. It could be used in honey, chocolate. It can even be used for testing metals.
It can also not just to the end, it could go through the full life cycle, even to the disposal piece, right? Like you could explore how much a certain, say, Uyghur cotton ends up in landfills in Tennessee or something, potentially, right?
Yeah, it gets a little tricky when you have mixtures of different materials. So we often get asked, can I verify the if there's Xinjiang cotton in this bundle of recycled cotton?
Mm.
In those cases, quite difficult because you're blending multiple origins from different sources. But if you have a shirt that you want to test that you want to know, does it come from India? And is there any forced labor mixed into the sample? Isotope testing can do that. And you can know within a few weeks what the exact claim origin is of that product. And that's useful to brands because they are the ones importing these goods into the US in particular. And they don't want to have any connection to high risk origins that may use forced labor in their products.
So you use the isotopes of the DNA. How does one check? I mean, I don't think you have people at ports of entry with scan codes, right? Is it you test chemically when bulk shipments come through to your warehouse or your sales room?
The samples have to be sent to a laboratory for testing. That testing can take 2 to 3 weeks to complete. It analyzes three isotopes. In the case of cotton, we're analyzing carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And so it's not a quick barcode scan. It's a destructive test where we actually have to take the sample and pulverize the material and then test it. But it's extremely accurate, and it gives you sort of the provenance of that material, which you wouldn't otherwise know because most people don't realize when you look at cotton fiber, it all looks the same. Like, cotton from Egypt looks the same as cotton from China and Australia.
Or Pima
And
cotton?
so,
Yeah.
correct. And so that adds another layer of anonymity
Hmm.
to the supply chain when products all look the same. And
Hmm.
that goes with coffee and chocolate and even aloe products.
What about seafood? My sister-in-law works as a wholesaler in seafood, and things get shipped that are supposedly sea bass, but they're not, or they're just completely mismarked.
Yeah, there's lots of different methods. Isotopes is one. Trace element analysis is another method, sort of akin to isotopes. There are different tools in the toolbox to analyze seafood and other materials. There isn't a one size fits all, but certainly in the case of if you're asking the question of where does the cotton come from, where does the seafood come from, then there are specific tools such as isotope testing that can help you answer those questions. But if you ask a different question, like, is this cotton Egyptian cotton or Pima cotton? There are other tools like DNA testing can tell you, for example, if it's Pima, because it's looking for the Pima DNA in that cotton,
Got it.
and it can answer that question. So it's a different tool for a different question.
Ladies and gentlemen, again today on the Caring Economy, we're really thrilled to have as our guest MeiLin Wan. She's the founder and CEO of GenuTrace LLC, and she is, I think, a super cool trailblazer when it comes to supply chain traceability, which matters to all of us. Even if you don't know what it is, you should find out because you're supporting those manufacturers, those workers, those industries that you're buying from. So make sure, what's the old Latin statement, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, know what you're getting. To that end, MeiLin, what is the two-part question? One is, who are some of your clients? Or if you can't name them, you can say, what their sort of descriptor. Is it fashion? Is it manufacturing? And then where are your obstacles right now to having this practice, really, this holistic practice take root?
Well, in terms of our clients, it's actually many different clients from different parts of the supply chain. So one part of the supply chain would be fiber producers, for example. We would work with companies that are creating new fibers. They can be from bio-based materials such as pineapples, for example. Many materials now that come from agricultural waste can be actually converted into fibers that could be made into towels or clothing even. And so our role is to get as close to the source material as much as possible and help the growers as well as the companies that are developing these innovative fibers to tell a compelling story that is genuine from the source all the way to the finished product. So that's an important part, and I think that will continue to be an area where we'll grow and expand. We also work with brands because many of the brands are not clear about how to go about verifying the product in the supply chain. So we can help them identify the different methods and tools and then help service their needs by providing the service to them directly. So that's an important area. For over 10 years, we helped bring about the first cotton end-to-end system for Costco
Mhm.
and Bed Bath and Beyond. They're not around anymore, but between Costco and Bed Bath, we covered basically all Pima cotton in the US for tagging fiber that was utilized in home textiles.
Mhm.
And through DNA tagging, and eventually we use isotope methods as well. We used a combination of tools to help verify that that cotton started in California and then was then still present in the yarn, in the fabric, and the finished bedding or
Mhm.
towel that was made. And Costco really was the first, I would say, to really own the supply chain. When they say that this product really is made from these farms,
Mhm.
it's true because they actually follow the supply chain.
Mhm.
And that's what made me feel very like happy because up until that point, it wasn't clear in 2014 when we started this that anyone even cared about, knowing where the materials come from.
Yeah.
And
But let me ask
even
you, go
even
ahead.
to this day, Costco, I would say, have some of the best practices because they don't try to sell too many goods in the store. They actually practice what they preach, which is really where I want to be working with
That's
clients
really
about
inspiring.
that.
And it's inspiring and it's relatable. I don't shop at Costco because we don't have one near us, but my brother loves it. And that's a big brand. So you're touching a lot of lives there. Let's talk a little bit about, in terms of obstacles, I think education is one of them. But also, I'm wondering about regulation. We're in a movement now where we have an administration that wants less regulation. A lot of your client business, I suspect, came from brands that needed to comply, right, with regulations. Do you think that that's going to be less the case going forward because the winds have changed, or do you think that brands like Costco are going to stay committed to ethically sourcing and reporting and tracing their supply chains?
That's a great question. I think that the companies that have already committed to ethical sourcing, to diversity, to a lot of important values, continue to do that because they already organized and invested quite a lot in time, in people, in the infrastructure. They've had detailed communications on and SOPs on what to do with the supply chain. The supply chain also are obviously working with other brands. And
Yes.
so you're hearing that from other brands. I think it's less likely that there will be a retraction in these protocols. What I do see in terms of in the case of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that act is going to become more important because a lot of these materials also are related to tariffs.
Mhm.
And given all the current discussions around tariffs, being able to prove origin is going to be extremely important because if you say you're using, for example, US yarn and you're sending that yarn to Guatemala, then when that product comes back into the US, it should be using US components in that product. And under the current CAFTA-DR legislation, there are rules already in place to show that you should be able to prove that it really does use US cotton or US yarn. So I see in some ways that the legislations that are already in place now need better enforcement and more a deeper dive into ensuring that what you say you're doing is in fact what's actually happening in the supply chain.
Yeah.
And so I think that we have to stay vigilant. We have to stay the course. And there's excellent legislation already in place. We don't need to create new ones, but we certainly need to have better ways to check physically the goods, not just saying, oh, this is another paper document that's in a blockchain, which are all good things, by the way, but having a means to physically send somebody in, check the product, and test it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions for your business around how to interpret the tariffs and what's American, what's Malaysian, what have you, You want to speak with MeiLin Wan at GenuTrace. MeiLin, tell us how to be in touch with you, and then tell us a little bit of the founding of GenuTrace.
Yeah, so you can reach me at genutrace.com or you can email us at sales@genutrace.com. GenuTrace is really founded on the principle of two words, genuine and traceability. And when we say that, it's not a just a buzzword or some superficial way of thinking about supply chains. We're here to genuinely help brands and manufacturers be able to support the claims that they make, be very accountable to the people that work in their supply chains, whether it's inside the company or outside the company. It's about trust. If you can't trust your own people and your own supply chain, then it really isn't going to be very sustainable as a business. So the idea is to enable and provide the tools to people, whether through technology or through just expertise or knowledge of supply chains, to help them make good decisions that are good for the environment, good for people, good for the planet, and to have transparency as the foundation of everything that we do. Because the more transparent we are, better we can help others. And as you know, the caring economy is about helping others. I think, this work in traceability is exactly that. And I'm very happy to be here. And anyone who'd like to talk about how to incorporate traceability in their supply chains, I'd love to talk to them.
Awesome. I'm mindful of your time. Two more questions for you. One is, you've been recognized as one of the outstanding 50 Asian Americans. You're a woman in a field that probably has been historically male. You're not a quote unquote Anglo or American born. So you check a lot of boxes in terms of minority. Can you talk a little bit about that, both what it's been like to navigate your way through all these different parts of the world and through the business route that you've done? And then the last question is, what lessons have you learned along the way? So what's it like to be where you are today, and what lessons have you learned?
Well, when I was awarded the award for the top Asian American business person, it really was quite personal to me because I felt that, the journey that I'd, undertaken, there was some affirmation of that. But what was even better was just seeing all the other Asian Americans in the same room and celebrating all the different fields and careers that they had.
Mm.
And so it was really great to see that because you don't ordinarily get the opportunity to be in a room with a lot of people of similar sort of ethno history, etc. So yeah, I really think that, you know, when you have the opportunity to be recognized for doing good, that makes you want to do even more
Yep.
and also help others along the way and share whatever knowledge you have with people who you wouldn't ordinarily think you would talk to.
Yeah.
And so that's what's been really great about it.
Yeah, and you serve as a mirror or a model for others who might be curious or want to. They say you have to see it to be it, right? So when someone sees you, a young Asian woman or a young person or young female in particular might say, "Oh, I could do that," or aspire to it. And then what about your lessons learned? Any pearls of wisdom you want to share?
Yeah, I think some of the pearls of wisdom is that you have to be adaptable and open-minded. Those two things help you to address change. And change is the one constant that we all have. The other pearl of wisdom really is to just give something a go. Even if you don't have all the information, even if it's not clear what the outcome will be, intuitively you feel you want to give it a go, you should follow your intuition and just give it a go.
Yep.
And I feel the same way with my company, that a lot of people would say, given everything happening in the world, maybe that's not the greatest idea. But I think it is the best idea in the face of all of this uncertainty, because the only thing is certain is myself.
Right. Through time.
And at least I know what I want to do. And I think people, if they felt that way, would take a chance and in themselves,
Yes.
actually, and just give it a go. And even if it doesn't work out, at least you tried.
Yes.
And and you can say, well, it was something that I wanted to pursue and see what would actually emerge from it. So
And you can only learn from it, right? So,
yeah,
particularly when you're younger, I think it's all the more reason to experiment and try things.
yeah, exactly. And I would say even more if you're older.
At this
If
point,
you're
yeah, what have you
older,
got to lose? I
there
mean,
is absolutely nothing to lose. In
I
fact, when
agree.
you're younger, you're more hesitant, like, oh, if I make, might take the wrong step. But there is really no wrong step. No one really tells you that until you're somewhat older and you realize there really isn't a wrong step because anything can happen at any time in the world. It's really how you respond to it. And just go with the flow. And if it works out, great. And even if it doesn't work out, that's still great because you're going to learn something from whatever you did in the first place.
I also do a lot of coaching and teaching around large language models and AI. This is a perfect example of the kinds of things one can run through AI and iterate, right? You can have a sounding board, a dialogue with yourself, but it's an informed self about, oh, if I do this, how could these skills transfer, or what might I do here? I do now you remind me one last question I should ask you. For those of us who aren't scientists, who are consumers, what sorts of tips or practices would you say to us to make sure that what we're buying is real, or should we be asking questions? How do we become part of the solution with you versus part of the problem, which the problem being, supporting kind of illicit or poor supply chains?
Well, I think of what I would do as a consumer, because as a consumer, when you go buy a product, you look at the label, you're like, okay, it says it's fair trade or it says it's organic, but how do I really know? So a few simple things you could do. You can Google, you could search and look for that product or that company
Yep.
and see, what's been happening and what they've been doing, if there's been any sort of bad press or any issues with recalls, etc., like that. There, if you even test search recall, there's a list of everything that's been recalled. Most consumers don't even know that. And one of the things US is very good for, which is different from other countries, is that the US generally has very good consumer protection laws. That's one of the strengths of US. And when we talk about supply chain transparency, the US is actually quite regulated, much to most people think, oh, there's not enough regulation. Actually, there's quite a lot of regulation in the US and also a lot of consumer protection laws. And therefore, generally, as you know, not in every case, if you make a product in the US, there's because of all the quality control and checks and everything, you generally will pay a little bit more for a product here in the US as opposed to if you bought a product from other countries like China or India. And not to say there isn't quality control in those countries, but generally speaking, in the US, if you're buying made in the US, for example, you have probably a higher chance of having stricter rules around human rights, around environmental controls, around quality control. And you even know, for example, the best example was the baby formula situation. There was baby formula that had melamine mixed into it. And again, melamine looks like baby powder. So the
Indeed.
only way to know was to actually test it and understand why so many babies either got very, very sick or died as a result of that. And so, yeah, the things that consumers can do, and they can also have the power to not buy.
Good point.
And if there are products that are too like the cost of the product is too good to be true, how is it possible to make a pair of jeans at $7, right? When you can't even in the US buy fabric to make that jean for $7. So that automatically should send you the message that there probably is child labor or forced labor related to it. The dyes on the jeans probably are not going to stay there. You're going to wash it and you're going to see all of the water turn blue. There are things that you can do to know that what you're buying is really not on. So consumers have the power to not buy products if they choose to do that.
And you've reminded me also, it's another reason why we want to stay engaged with the policy making in our government system, because that's where the regulation, the oversight, the enforcement comes. So I can't thank you enough. It's been so great having you today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's MeiLin Wan. She's the founder and CEO of GenuTrace. And I can't wait to see where your business goes over the next 10 years. And I can't wait to meet you in person, hopefully with our good friend, Marshall.
Thank
Thank you
you.
again, MeiLin, from our CEO of GenuTrace and founder. We just love hearing your story, and I hope you come back, and I wish you great success and can't wait to meet you in person with Marshall.
All right. Thanks, Toby.
Be well.